Over the last few years, there has been significant focus on financing climate solutions and nature conservation through mechanisms such as biodiversity and climate credits. Wildlife Works is one organization which has pioneered the use of economic solutions to drive transformative levels of finance directly to forest communities for their own development goals. Join Mike Korchinsky, the founder and president of Wildlife Works, as he elaborates upon how the organization has successfully conserved large areas of wilderness, utilizing mechanisms such as carbon credits and REDD+. So, welcome, Mike, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you, Anish.
So, what got you into conservation?
I think from an early age, I was a lover of wildlife. I'm always fascinated by wildlife, and particularly elephants, even though I lived in countries that didn't have elephants. So that was my early fascination with wildlife. What got me into wildlife professionally was visiting Africa in the mid-90s and seeing the conflict between people and wildlife over natural resources, which seemed very obvious to me, but was not being discussed much at all at that time in the conservation community.
So, talk about Wildlife Works. How did it come into being and what was the idea behind it?
On that trip, I realized that if we didn't find a way to make wildlife work for the local communities, then they would, like most communities around the world, push wildlife out of their region and out of their lives, and eventually, when we're all doing that, out of existence. So it struck me that a new model for conservation that focused on the needs of communities, focused on bringing value to communities that live with wildlife in ways that were much more ambitious, shall we say, and much more integrated in their lives and their livelihoods than tourism, which of course is a piece of a puzzle in some places when it comes to wildlife. And so that idea of creating a new model that was market-based and that would bring value to these communities based on the conservation of their natural world was intriguing to me, both professionally and ideologically, because I didn't want to see, of course, the wildlife disappear from these places. So I had the idea to start Wildlife Works on that first trip to Africa. It took me a year and a half to figure out I guess maybe pick up the courage to leave the job that I had in the professional, my first career, and start Wildlife Works, which we did in 1998. And Kenya was the place that I had the idea to do Wildlife Works. So Kenya was where I focused my initial efforts on, and in particular, as we wanted to demonstrate that we could create a solution to the human-wildlife conflict, we wanted to pick an area that had intense human-wildlife conflict. So we picked a corridor between two national parks in Kenya, where elephants, of course, they don't know where the boundaries of the parks are, so they traditionally migrated back and forth in this area, which was now becoming increasingly used by slash and burn agriculture for farms, for communities, for growing communities. And so we wanted to work with the growing communities to see if there was a better option for them that would leave the corridor intact so that elephants could continue to migrate.
So, Wildlife works extensively with carbon credits in a lot of your projects. So, what exactly are carbon credits?
Yeah, the carbon credit idea emerged after we started. We were founded before the Kyoto Protocol, when carbon was not, and climate was not widely understood. So we had to wait a few years for carbon to come along as a revenue source for our activity. So we had tried a bunch of other things in the decade prior, and none of which particularly worked. They worked great for conservation because the community was happy to be getting benefits from us as an investor in their community. but they weren't sustainable. And so we were looking for a better solution when Red Plus was put forward by the UN and then by Vera. We felt that that was an ideal model because of the way it values wilderness and based on threat to that wilderness. And so we started up in 2009 to focus on carbon as a source of income for our projects around the world. And initially, that project in Kenya became the first project of its type to be issued credits under the Vera standard back in 2011. And then from there, we really liked the model. We were able to attract some investment and expand into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because we felt that if you're really going to leverage the market for climate finance to protect forests, then you need to be where the big threatened forests are, and the DRC is one of those countries, second largest tropical forest nation on Earth. So we built a project there and a relationship there with community and government, and then from there we've moved on to develop projects all over the world.
So there's been quite a bit of criticism about carbon credits as a whole. So could you just briefly talk about some of these criticisms and how carbon credits can be improved to negate these shortcomings?
Sure. There are so I would say, two classes of criticism. There's criticism of the concept in its entirety, that there are those out there that believe that the market is the cause of all of our societal problems and challenges, especially the ones related to the environment and damage to the environment. And therefore, the market shouldn't be entrusted with fixing the problem. So there's an ideological argument that we hear a lot, and that is probably the most virulent and passionate from the young people, mostly who believe that. They don't necessarily have a practical alternative, but they just feel that it's wrong that the market be involved in solving the problem that the market created. And I have no issue with that ideological view. I just think that from a practical standpoint, the market is what we have and what we have to work with when we need resources. So there's that view. And then there's the view that the market should exist, but should be better, should not allow bad actors into the market, should be more transparent, should not be an opportunity for opportunists to come and try and make money. The history of any market is that in the early going, and maybe there are opportunists in our world that will see it as a way just to make money and not to contribute to the intended outcome of the market. But that it's a very small number, but that did happen in our market. We had those opportunists show up and attempt to make money in ways that were not legitimate. But the broader criticism of the quality of the market, we don't feel is justified. Certainly not in our category of the nature-based solutions category. I think one of the things you have to understand about the carbon market is it's so broad that it's very difficult to generalize, even though it all rests on the same financial asset, which has been a blessing and a curse for the market. But you can get a carbon credit for painting your aircraft more often so that it has less drag when it's flying. That's a methodology somebody wrote and has generated carbon credits. And you can get a carbon credit for protecting a rainforest from imminent destruction. So the same asset, two entirely different activities. And even in our category, I think there was, again, not enough focus from the broader market on the impact that nature-based projects will naturally have in the real world with people and biodiversity. So some of the values that go along with a nature-based project, were optional. And so again, we felt that was a mistake of the market. We have always focused our work on the nexus between community development, so voluntary action by communities to improve their livelihoods, and the protection of wildlife and wilderness. And so how do you make those two things work together. And so for us, it was always a requirement that our projects have those dimensions of community development and wildlife conservation. But that wasn't required. So the market had developed a range of projects, some of which were not doing anything for those elements or doing very little. So I think what we saw was, just perhaps a normal early market chaos a little bit, and enthusiasm. So married to enthusiasm, and that caused everybody to want to step back when certain issues came to light of the where there were clearly bad actors doing things inappropriately in the market. But we know from having been in the market for 20 years that the vast majority, certainly all the people we know about in our market, in the nature-based solutions market, are fully engaged in trying to solve one of the most difficult problems we have, which is how do we stop deforestation and biodiversity loss in a very short time frame before it becomes lost forever.
So you had briefly mentioned that Wildlife Works is developing various RED projects. So what exactly is a RED Plus project? And talk about the framework, the RED Plus framework developed by UN.
Right. I'm going to switch the order there just so we start with the definition. RED Plus, REDD plus, stands for, it's a long definition, but I'm going to use the short version that everybody uses. Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation is what the REDD stand for. The plus encompasses another two sentences that talk about sustainable use of forests, and importantly, at the end of that definition is the phrase "in developing countries," and which of course is a phrase that we don't use that much anymore, but it's important in the sense that RED Plus was designed as a mechanism to address the needs of what we sometimes now call the global south, but the developing countries. So it isn't a tool. RED Plus itself is not a tool for American companies or Chinese companies, for that matter. It is a tool for the global south. There are equivalents in the US, of course. There are forest carbon markets in the US and in China, so they've developed their equivalents. But RED Plus, in its definition, was focused on the global south. And so what does that mean? Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Deforestation is relatively well understood. You had a forest and it's no longer a forest. Degradation is less well understood, which is what happens when people start cutting down trees in a forest, but it is still a forest. So they're degrading the forest over time, but they don't degrade it to a point where it's non-forest, where it's not a forest anymore. So those are the two categories of loss of forest in the natural world that relate to the carbon markets, because they cause emissions. When you deforest or when you cut down trees to degrade a forest, you're creating emissions. In depending on what the use of the wood is and depending on what the use of the land is, there's a wide range of outcomes in terms of how many emissions that you're creating, and depending on where you are in the world and how rich in carbon the forests are, because carbon is directly related to the size and the weight of trees. And so big forests have more carbon, small forests have less carbon. So the mechanism was designed in recognition of the fact that of the 50 billion tons a year of global emissions, give or take 15% of those come from forests. They come from people destroying forest in one way or another, either deforesting or degrading forest. And so it's a vast contribution to the climate problem that doesn't have an obvious industrial sector that you can regulate. You can't regulate individual people in countries that are just meeting their own needs, feeding their families and putting them in school. And so it's a sector that did need a different mechanism at a fundamental level to address the economic needs that are underlying the loss of forest in the global south. So that's the RED Plus mechanism was created with the idea that if you are able to prove that you're reducing the emissions associated with deforestation and degradation, then on a on a scientific calculation basis of how many tons of emissions did you actually reduce, you are able to market those emission reductions into the companies that are voluntarily, it's a voluntary market initiative for the most part in the world. You're able to market those into companies that want to demonstrate that they're going above and beyond what they can do in reducing their own internal carbon emissions and spend some of their profits protecting forests. So that was the mechanism, was a UN mechanism. It has many levels. It's evolved in different ways, but the majority of activity in the last decade has been in the voluntary market and has been under the Verra standard. Certainly the majority, all of our activity has been under the Verra standard in the last decade. And so what does the REDD+ project look like? We get asked that question a lot. I can only speak to what ours look like because I actually haven't visited a lot of other ones. So what ours look like is they look to a large degree like an integrated community development project where we begin with the community as partners to define what their needs are and what they would need to see in a theory of change. So what would need to happen in their community so that they could remove their dependence or reduce their dependence on the natural forest. And so and then the project is first identifying what those activities are and what those investments that the community would like to see are, and then implementing those. So we operate projects on the ground with hundreds of employees that work for us that are from the community that are doing a wide range of development activities from addressing all the major human needs. So education, healthcare, food security, housing, energy, these are all the basic needs that any community has. And oftentimes in these rural forest communities, the solution to many of those is trees. And so trying to help them find alternatives is a large part of the work we do, and helping them be more productive in their agriculture so that they need less land to feed themselves and so that they can earn income from farming, from a surplus of farming. So the projects themselves look like a whole lot of people on the ground doing rural development type activities, but they also are construction projects. We've constructed 28 schools in our Mayandambe project in the DRC because without a school, the education system stalls historically. So we provide school bursaries. So the projects do. The communities decide essentially how they want to spend the money that they earn from the project to ensure that they are supportive of the activities the project is doing. They make the decision about what kind of activities the project should invest in.
So, talking about REDD projects, what exactly is free prior informed consent and why is it needed?
Free prior informed consent is the very beginning of the process for us, and it should be for any developer, which is before you go and start investing or conducting activities within a community that would lead to an eventual REDD+ project, you need to make sure that the community broadly supports that decision, and that decision is very transparent, and that decision, of course, honors the governance system of the community because that's what they have and that's how they make decisions. But it involves basically the informed part involves a lot of education, a lot of them understanding what it is that a REDD+ project will bring to their community, both what it is and what it isn't, because there are many rumors that you find in these small communities that somebody, for one reason or another, has planted in their community about what a REDD+ project might be that are completely untrue. And so it's a fair bit of education up front to help make sure they understand what it is that they're going to be embarking on. It's a negotiation because at some level, there's money that comes into these projects that needs to be distributed amongst the stakeholders. And the stakeholders are generally the community, in our opinion, the community first, government, and us, and then occasionally there are other stakeholders. If there are some private lands within the scope of the project, then the owners of those private lands also have to consent to the use of their land for a project like this. So that's the informed part. The consent part is that you have to explain exactly what the project is going to do. They have to agree to whatever, if there are any restrictions. So in other words, if they're going to reduce the amount of wood they use, they have to agree to voluntarily reduce the amount of wood they use. And they have to stipulate what their requirements would be in order to allow them to do that. And so that's the negotiating part, is, okay, how are we going to get every dollar that we can earn by selling a carbon credit back into this community in a way that it enables them to make good on the agreement, essentially, and reduce their emissions from forest. And so the free part means you can't coerce them into that agreement. Obviously, that seems obvious. It has to be a voluntary decision that they make in their own governance system. The prior part seems obvious. It needs to happen before the project starts, so that you're not already embarking on activities before you've received consent from the community. Informed, we talked about, and then consent needs to be demonstrable in some tangible way. So there needs to be a written consent. Oftentimes these days, almost every time now, with the community's consent, we record the meetings that are involved in FPIC during that process, which, by the way, can run for years while the community educates themselves and becomes more and more accustomed to what it is that they're going to do. Certainly in the last 10 years, we've had FPIC processes that have run for many years. It's becoming easier these days because more and more communities now understand what REDD+ is. Even in the Amazon or in the Congo Basin, they've seen a project that's been successful and that has generated significant funding for other communities, and they are predisposed to want their own project. So that's been a shift in the last 5 years, I'd say, pretty substantial shift to where the FPIC process can become a little faster, because we don't need to do so much informing, because they've informed themselves in some cases of what the opportunity looks like. But it's not a fast process. It shouldn't be thought of as a fast process. Communities need the time it should go at the community's pace. The communities need the time to evaluate these opportunities at their own pace. And when they're ready, they're ready. And as I said, that pace is increasing naturally as communities become more well-informed about what a project would look like.
So talk about the concepts of additionality, leakages, and permanence.
So the broad idea that behind the market is that it's providing financing to achieve emission reductions that would not naturally be achieved without the carbon finance. So that's the concept of additionality. There has to be a way to demonstrate that these carbon credits, or these emission reductions, they're synonymous, by the way. An emission reduction is reducing pollution, essentially, reduce emissions by 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. And a carbon credit is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. But the carbon credit is the name that commonly people give to the asset that gets generated if you stop the emission of or if you absorb. The same thing. You can either absorb CO2 or you can stop the emission of CO2. Those two things can both earn you a carbon credit. Of course, standing forests do both. If you keep a forest standing that was going to be cut down, you've avoided emitting a lot of CO2 that was stored in the forest over centuries. And you've also maintained that forest as a carbon sink that will continue to sequester carbon in the future. So it's a double benefit to the climate to stop forests from being destroyed. But so additionality is about demonstrating that the carbon finance is necessary to achieve that outcome. Permanence is, and in our category, additionality is essentially not really a question, or very rarely questioned, because there is no money in our world associated. Sadly, this is part of the problem we have. There's no money associated with protecting the natural world. There's other than philanthropy, which isn't a market mechanism. So in the market, there's no market value other than carbon. So it's very easy for us to demonstrate that the alternatives to protecting forest are more valuable and therefore there's a financial additionality. There's for us to step in and forego, or for the community essentially to forego those added values of destroying the forest in favor of protecting the forest. So additionality is not usually questioned. I've never been in a serious discussion in our category. In other categories, it can be highly contested, and certainly there are individual projects, perhaps in the conservation arena, where a forest was philanthropically protected, and maybe they made the claim at the time they did that it was in perpetuity. And so now you can't really make an argument that you need to go back to the market and ask for more money. Carbon mechanism. So there are rare occasions where perhaps additionality still needs to be is questioned, but for the most part, additionality is not a significant issue in our work, because everybody understands that conserving forests does not generate income for these communities, and the other options do. Permanence is the idea that when you avoid the emissions from a forest, in order for that to have significant climate benefit, those reductions have to be permanent, meaning, or at least as permanent as we can measure. And the reason that's an issue in the nature-based solution space is if I protect a tree today and then it gets cut down tomorrow, I didn't really do much. I saved the climate for one day. So all the projects have to demonstrate how a long period of time that the project will operate to protect forest, during which time the project is held accountable for any emissions that do come from the forest, and performance is not earned on, and credits are not earned on any performance that until you demonstrate that it's better than the reductions that occur, or the emissions that occurred. Excuse me. So permanence is about how long the reduction is good for. In theory, it should be forever, right? Because we're trying to avoid CO2 getting to the atmosphere forever. And in practice, if you protect a natural forest, it will have a natural carbon cycle where trees die and other trees grow. But in general, it's the most standing forests are sinks. They're continuing to absorb CO2. So there's not so as long as you keep the forest standing for 40 years is the minimum probably these days, or 100 years is preferable, but then you can demonstrate, as long as is necessary under the current market conditions and market standards, that the reductions are permanent. In some ways, the idea of permanence is not just a nature-based solutions issue. It's not just, people sometimes say it's just about trees being able to be burnt down in a forest fire or cut down. And certainly that is a risk that only forest projects bear. But energy use, renewable energy use, if a country implements renewable energy, but at the same time implements, the energy facility fails. We're hearing a lot now because of climate change that wind facilities, for example, that were designed to run for 30 years and achieve a certain level of emissions reductions are not running for that length of time because the wind patterns are changing. So there's this uncertainty in most sectors about how long the intervention will be active. And the way the market addresses that, just to get to the conclusion on permanence, is that all projects have to contribute to a risk buffer. So there's a risk, and the risk is assessed project by project of whether there's likely to be a reversal, meaning the forest actually does get destroyed while it's under conservation in a REDD+ project. And because that would invalidate credits, then there's a buffer pool, an insurance pool, essentially, that the standard establishes, that will ensure that any customer that bought a credit from that forest project still got a reduction of CO2 by getting a credit from the pool of all the projects in the system, and not just nature-based projects, but all the projects in the system. So it's a risk-based way, risk-balancing way of mitigating against the obvious. It's impossible to prove that a forest would never be destroyed because it's a natural forest. So that's the way that the market handles permanence. Leakage, the last one, is about, if I'm a simple example would be, I'm a logging company and I want to have a carbon project in one of my concessions, and I get permission to do that, and I just move my logging to the next door forest and get a new logging concession on the next door forest. And so my emissions as a logging company haven't changed. I'm still logging the same, but now I'm getting carbon from a forest that I previously logged, and that isn't allowed in the system. So that leakage has to be assessed in various ways. There's different kinds of leakage. There's leakage associated with the activities that might be being displaced. So logging as an activity that's being displaced by a carbon project, that you have to address what happens to that activity and make sure that it's not just moving somewhere else. And then there's market leakage, which is to say, if the destruction of the forest was for market reasons, like to be able to plant palm oil, for example, then you have to demonstrate that the forest that you're conserving didn't just move the pressure of forests to somewhere else. And so these are concepts that the market has had to address. All projects have to address those concepts in their design to the satisfaction of the standard, and there's assessed reductions in what credits are available to the project from its performance in reducing deforestation and degradation based on the analysis of permanence and leakage. So there are scenarios where if the leakage cannot be mitigated, the project can't continue. And so and similarly for permanence, if the risk is too high that the forest would be destroyed, then it's not a viable carbon project from the beginning.
So now let's talk about Wildlife Works and your projects. So what role does Wildlife Works has as a REDD Plus project developer? What safeguards do you guys implement in these projects?
Well, we are known because we become so successful globally in developing this kind of project as a REDD Plus project developer, but we that is not who we are. We're a wildlife conservation company that had a mission from 1997 to bring market-based finance into communities to allow them to find pathways that are consistent with maintaining wildlife in their environment. So we are who we've always been, which is a wildlife conservation company. We use carbon finance as the financing mechanism, and it's a very good one because of the way it's designed to encourage the reduction in threat to forests, which wildlife need. So we're, because of that origin, and because we started working with communities first to try and help them understand, or try and help us understand what they need in order to have a lighter footprint in their own environment, then all these issues of FPIC and of community consultation and of safeguards are a natural part of our business. We've always started from a position of partnering with communities on the basis of what they need. And increasingly so, as we work in the Amazon with indigenous people, they are very clear about their needs. And they're also the project owners now. That's been a shift that we've seen, is that as communities have become more aware of the opportunity, they want to own their own projects. And so we become essentially a partner to help them build their own project, rather than that we're building a project that they're consenting to participate in. We believe the stronger model is that they own these projects and that we are consenting to, or they're consenting to allow us to participate in the project. So we have experts in, FPIC. Many of them are from the social development world. Some of them are indigenous themselves, because indigenous communities represent all walks of society these days. And so we as a company have always focused on those matters. We have our own operating procedures that are well documented to make sure that all of our projects perform the same level of effort in ensuring those safeguards are upheld. And then it's a day-to-day thing, because we're not a developer in the sense that we come and go in and out of the community. Our partnership with the community is long-term. So we have teams on the ground 7/24, 365 days a year for 15 years in these communities that are working side by side with the community to ensure that the project is successful and that the community is is continuing to be enthusiastic and supportive of the project. So we take a very hands-on approach, even though most of those employees in the community are community members themselves that have been hired and trained to do environmental service jobs, such as measuring and monitoring. They are employed by the project and therefore by us, and therefore we can work very closely with them to ensure the outcomes that we want. So that's our approach to safeguards. We think that things like FPIC are ongoing processes. It's not the community. The conditions of the community are changing constantly. The opportunities are changing. The pressures are changing. The market's changing. So we constantly revisit FPIC with our communities along the way, to not because we want the projects to end, but because we want them to continue. We want them to continue in a way, but to be adaptable and flexible to the needs of the community so that they continue to remain relevant, because these projects do have to operate for generations. And so it's important that they not be hidebound and stuck in one idea. Obviously, because the community's ideas will change over time. So we see that as an ongoing process. And we've got, I would say 15 years experience of managing that process in the field with communities. And we are generally well recognized and by communities as being very good at it. So I think, which has led to our opportunity to expand globally, which is what we've been doing for the last couple of years.
Talk about some of the regions where wildlife work operates in, and how exactly do you identify a location for a project?
We understand the economics of carbon projects very well, of this particular kind of project, a REDD+ project. So we can fairly easily determine whether a potential project has merit. Once upon a time, we thought we would just sort of strategically look at forests that we thought needed these kinds of projects for high conservation value. And so we did a bit of proactive thinking about where we'd like to be able to work with a community to conserve a particular species or group of species or ecosystem. And what we found, though, is that the conservation community is an old community. So someone's working somewhere everywhere, generally. And so we've reverted, and as we became better known, more and more communities would reach out to us, whether it be the indigenous people or the local community themselves, or whether it be the government looking for partners for communities, or whether it be an NGO that's operating locally in the conservation space that wants a partner to help them develop an income from carbon. And so we essentially now are more reactive. We sort of respond to inbound inquiries mostly, and then we run them through what we have a pre-feasibility checklist, which requires us to gather a certain amount of information before we can see that there's any potential. All of these places are important, so I'm not going to say importance, but potential to fit the carbon model is easy for us to determine. It's not purely formulaic, because the carbon market price, for example, plays an important role in what the economic opportunity for the community is going to be. And so scale is the other factor. So price in the market makes more projects more viable. So that's true. If the price is going up, then more projects will be economically attractive to communities and of interest to them. But scale is a permanent factor. If they're a larger area, they're generally going to generate more potential reductions, because more forest under threat that you protect means more reductions against a baseline of emissions that would otherwise have occurred. So scale matters. So we used to have we used to have a minimum size that we felt that we could get involved with. And again, it's not because we don't think small projects are important. Of course they are. It's just that the cost and the overhead associated with having a partner like us involved requires a minimum scale, so that the majority of the funding is still available to the communities. So we have a fairly rigorous process to select, but to answer where we are, started in Africa. So first two projects were in Kenya. The third one was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We've been granted 4 new projects in the DRC by the government, and we're working on developing those. We then went to Colombia in 2016 or 17 and worked with USAID, who was funding some projects for communities in Colombia, in the Afro-Colombian communities along the Pacific coast. And through those relationships, which lasted for a number of years, we then developed our own projects in Colombia. So we have 5 projects that are in Colombia with either indigenous communities in the Amazon or Afro-Colombian communities in the Darien, in the Pacific region. We have most recently, and that was where we were up until 2021. And then starting in 2021, we started to expand again, and we have a project in India with an indigenous people in the Northeast. We have a project in Cambodia, a couple of them actually. We have a couple of projects in Indonesia with community forestry initiatives there. We have a project in the Solomon Islands, which is to provide an economic alternative to illegal logging of the forest there. We have a number of projects beginning in Brazil. Brazil is our most recent country, and so it is the largest tropical forest on Earth. And also the one that's lost the highest amount of forest. It's lost more forest than the second largest forest in the world. But it's still the largest forest in the world, which just gives you a sense of how important the Amazon was and why everybody talks about the Amazon. So we have a number of projects in Brazil. We have projects in Panama with an indigenous community called the Cuna in Panama, and that one is one of the ones we've been working with that community for more than 10 years to help them develop that project or get them ready to see the need for the project. And now it's moving forward more quickly. So that's the broad profile of where we are. The sad truth is there's probably not a tropical forest in the world that's not under threat in some way or other. And so there are plenty of places that we could go work. Like any company that's funded by our activities, we have to be careful about how many we take on at any one time, because we have to balance the growth in our ability to work with communities to produce supply of carbon credits with the growth in demand for carbon credits in the market from the corporate community that is voluntarily buying these things. So that's the other side of the coin of how we can grow our impact. Of course, because our goal is to conserve wildlife and we see threatened wildlife everywhere, we'll grow as much as we possibly can, as quickly as we possibly can, because we all know that the next decade is critical. Those of us that work in this field know that the next decade is critical in turning the tide on deforestation and biodiversity loss. So there is a ticking clock that we all in this field sense, those of us that are serious about solving the problems that we have with deforestation and biodiversity loss.
So Wildlife Works also supports various eco businesses. What is this initiative about?
Let me think. So in each of our projects, one of the things that we always look for are economic solutions for the community that are not dependent on the forest. So, or they may be dependent on the forest in the sense of non-timber forest products, but they're not dependent on the destruction of forest. So we're always trying to identify small, opportunities where they can generate new income for the community, whether that be through improved agriculture, whether that be through crafts that they use traditionally, but that are beautiful and might be of value in the international craft market. And sometimes those initiatives become independent entities owned by members of the community or the community themselves. So there's a variety of those in our projects in Africa and in Colombia, which are the most developed projects. What we find generally in our projects in the early years, the communities want to invest the money in infrastructure like education and healthcare because they don't have access to primary education or primary healthcare, and that they know is a fundamental element of their improving livelihoods into the future. So they generally always want to start there, and only when they generate enough income to have met those needs do they start thinking about livelihoods. They start thinking about, okay, well, what are we going to do to earn money as a people now that we're not logging, for example, or now that we're not selling bushmeat? What is the income that we're going to have? And so that's when we shift to, other than the carbon income, so something that's more long-term and not just part of the carbon project. So that's when they start thinking about livelihoods and start thinking about what else they could be doing now with their time to earn other sources of income for the community. And that's our initial focus, is we as a company aren't looking for ways so that we can earn money from those streams. We want the community to earn as much as they can from those other income streams, because every dollar they earn in a way that's supportive of conservation strengthens their commitment to the project.
What has been some of the key challenges you have faced at Wildlife Works?
Having been around longer than anybody in the space, the challenge has been waiting for the market to develop, and the hiccups that the market has had in its development process. So I would say that's in the simplest answer is the market has not matured in a way that quickly enough, in all honesty, to address the severity and the scale of the problem that we have with deforestation globally. And we hope that changes now, that there's been some correction or some review of the market, and with a goal of accelerating the impact that at least that's our view of what needs to happen, is the market needs to be much bigger so that it can support more impact quickly, because we are running out of time. So the market's instability over the last 15 years has been the biggest challenge, and there's many dimensions of that. One dimension of that is that the corporate community has been slow to uptake this idea, because they don't have to. It's voluntary, and they have to make money. So if in an economic downturn, corporates aren't making money, they don't have money to spend on things that are outside their core business. So that over a long period of time that these projects operate has also become a challenge, is that they have up and down with economic conditions in the marketplace. And then I would say the one that's the most frustrating in some ways is that the environmental community is, I'm going to sound a bit like a Trump statement here, the environmental community likes to eat its own children. So they're not, there's a not invented here problem in the environmental community, which comes, I think, maybe from the fact that the vast majority of environmental activity or conservation activity has been donor funded, and that many of these groups feel like they're all competing for the same donor dollar. So it's created this very non-collaborative world for conservation broadly, and specifically, it's created this environment where some NGOs, some activist-driven NGOs that oppose market-based mechanisms, are attacking other NGOs who both have exactly the same mission of furthering conservation and development of communities, but are approaching it in different ways. But they, instead of just going about their own business and seeing how successful everybody can be, there's been some infighting, and the infighting that's the most disappointing to me, to see that at this point, when we need everything everywhere all at once, that some of these well-intentioned people with different ideas are competing with each other. And we'd like to see that change and have more of a collaborative platform for these groups more broadly. But in the end, that's above our pay grade, as we say here in the US. So we soldier on, but that has been one of the challenges, because that has created instability in the market. The corporates don't understand, why is one environmental group attacking another environmental group. It's led to some upsets in progress that we don't have the luxury of, given the short timeline we have to significantly address these global challenges. So those, I would say, those are the main things. There's subsets of that we've as a pioneer, we've had to invent a lot of things. We see things, and having been on the ground for 27 years, and we see the development of the market in ways that others that are involved in it maybe not, and that has caused us to invest in certain things that we feel are necessary for a better functioning market that is designed to achieve the outcome of forest conservation and wildlife conservation. So that's been expensive, to be honest, to be a pioneer and invest in some of these ideas to promote better outcomes for the market, and that's been a challenge as well. So yeah, and today I think the goal is there's all kinds of money in the market, which is why this market mechanism still makes the most sense. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be driven to these communities in a much more efficient way than it is now. And that's, I would say, the last challenge is that for the most part, the money that's engaging in the market is in the global north, and that our part of the market they're engaging in is in the global south, and that there's an asymmetry of knowledge and there's an asymmetry of objectives there that needs to be addressed. We do a lot of work educating corporates on why they should care about communities in the middle of the Congo. And so that's been that natural difference between people operating in the companies in the global north and communities in the global south is also a challenge to overcome. But because we need a lot more corporates engaging.
And my final question is, what are some ways where individuals can contribute to wildlife works?
Well, we do produce these things called carbon credits, and there are a couple of platforms where you can go find our carbon credits and buy our carbon credits. And if you're an individual and you feel like everybody has a carbon footprint. Everybody, human beings are emission generating machines. We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2. So just the same thing that trees do at night. Trees do the opposite during the day. They breathe in CO2 and they breathe out oxygen. So so everything we do creates emissions. And so we as individuals all have some responsibility shared for this, whether it's driving a car or heating our homes, et cetera, et cetera. So individuals can take responsibility for their piece of the pie by engaging with us in buying our credits. So that's one way. There are also products that we produce from our various initiatives that can be found on the internet. If you visit our website, you'll be able to find the sister efforts like Hadithi that produce crafts for sale. And then most importantly, I think, is just be thoughtful about support for these kinds of environmental initiatives and be aware that there are always more opinions about everything in the world in which we live, but everything is more complicated than some of those opinions would have it appear. So be supportive in general, give people the benefit of the doubt that have been working for 30 years to protect wildlife, and get engaged in some way or another to try and promote the message that we need to be doing more quickly and not less.
So that was a final question for this interview. Thank you so much for your time. I will be putting a link to your website in our description so that people can visit your site, buy carbon credits, and even support a lot of your eco ventures.
Great. Thanks, Anish.
If you made it till the end of this podcast, feel free to leave your thoughts on the topic and do not forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another list of conservation books which I highly recommend. This time it is on the topic of rewilding and ecological restoration. The first is a seminal book called Rewilding: The Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery by Glenn Blight and Paul Chipson, which covers the restoration of ecological processes and ecosystem functioning by the reintroduction of species, especially megaherbivores. A less technical and science-heavy book is Rewilding Africa: The Restoration of Wilderness on a War-Ravaged Continent, which explores conservation across various heavily militarized landscapes. And the final book is Wilder: How Rewilding is Transforming Conservation and Changing the World. This covers the rewilding of various charismatic species ranging from pumas in the US to the Arabian oryx in the Middle East and giant tortoise. And with that, I would like to end this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. See you next Monday.